The desert air hung thick with stillness, broken only by the faint hum of distant insects and the whisper of wind weaving through jagged rock formations. Captain Leora Grant stood at the edge of a wide plateau, her boots sinking slightly into the sand. The night pressed heavy around her, the stars above stark and unwavering, their light a cold mockery of the heat that still lingered in the earth. She didn't need to look at her watch to know the time. The tension that coiled in her chest, the gnawing sense of waiting, told her all she needed to know. "Captain?" A voice broke through the static of her earpiece, clipped and low. Sergeant Quinn, reliable, methodical, and perpetually skeptical. "Go ahead," Leora murmured, her eyes trained on the horizon. "We've got movement on the eastern ridge," Quinn reported. "It's faint, but not natural. Definitely mechanical." Her heart thudded once, hard and deliberate, against her ribs. She nodded, though Quinn couldn't see her. "Hold your position, eyes sharp, I'm moving in." The plateau stretched wide and empty, a perfect stage for the unknown. This was a place no one came willingly, a lifeless expanse where the military conducted its most secret operations. And yet, the reports had been clear. An object, unidentified and immense, had streaked across the sky hours ago, its trajectory an unmistakable descent into this forsaken wasteland. The surveillance drones hadn't picked up much more than residual heat signatures and a faint electromagnetic pulse. But there had been something else, too. A sound. It wasn't the sharp crack of an explosion or the groaning protest of metal on impact. It was low, resonant, almost melodic, a sound that lingered at the edge of perception, vibrating through the bones. Leora moved carefully, each step deliberate, as she made her way toward the ridge. Her squad was spread out, forming a loose perimeter around the area of interest. Shadows loomed large, stretched by the thin light of the moon. Her fingers brushed against the butt of her sidearm, the reassuring weight a silent promise of readiness. Then she saw it. The craft lay half buried in the sand, its surface sleek and unbroken, a dark, mirror-like material that seemed to drink in the moonlight rather than reflect it. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. No visible seams, no markings, no exhaust ports. A gentle hum radiated from it, barely audible, but enough to make the hairs on her arms rise. She pressed her hand to her earpiece. "Quinn, I've got eyes on the object, confirming contact." "Understood. Do you need backup?" Leora hesitated. The thing was massive, its presence almost oppressive, yet nothing stirred around it, no sign of life or movement. And still, a prickling unease crept along her spine, an instinct honed by years in the field. "Hold position. I'm going closer." She approached slowly, her steps crunching softly against the sand. The craft's surface shimmered faintly, as though reacting to her proximity. The hum deepened, shifting in tone, and Leora froze. Then a light appeared. It wasn't blinding or harsh. It emerged like a sunrise, blooming softly along the edge of the craft, a pale blue that pulsed rhythmically. It wasn't just a light, she realized. It was a pattern. Symbols formed and dissolved, intricate and alien, flowing like liquid script across the surface. Her breath caught. This wasn't debris. It wasn't some rogue satellite or classified tech from another nation. This was something else. "Captain," Quinn's voice crackled in her ear, laced with urgency. "We've got movement all around you. Sensors are picking up heat signatures closing in fast." Leora's hand flew to her weapon, her eyes scanning the darkness. The ridge loomed to her left, jagged rocks casting long shadows, but the sand around her was empty. "Where? I don't see—" Her words died as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly so, its form humanoid, yet unmistakably alien. Pale, almost translucent skin seemed to shimmer faintly, and its eyes, piercing, luminous, and unsettlingly human, locked onto hers. It wore no visible clothing, but its body was adorned with thin metallic lines that pulsed with the same blue light as the craft. The figure raised a hand, palm outstretched, a gesture that might have been a greeting or a warning. "Identify yourself," Leora barked, raising her weapon, though her voice wavered despite her best effort. The figure didn't speak. Instead, its lips moved silently, forming words she couldn't hear. Then, as though triggered by her presence, the craft behind it began to shift. Panels slid apart with a seamless grace, revealing an interior bathed in soft light. Her squad's voices filled her ear now, overlapping and urgent. "Captain, get out of there! Fall back now!" But she couldn't move. The figure stepped closer, the air around it shimmering faintly, and for a fleeting moment, Leora felt as though the ground beneath her had vanished. The figure raised its other hand, pointing toward her chest. She braced for something, a weapon, a strike, anything. Instead, it spoke. "You don't know what you'll become." The voice was soft yet resonant, as though it came from everywhere at once. Leora's grip on her weapon tightened. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned and walked into the craft, the door sliding shut behind it with a soundless finality. The hum grew louder, a deep, resonating thrum that sent vibrations rippling through her chest. The light around the craft brightened, forcing her to shield her eyes, and then, in an instant, it was gone, leaving nothing but scorched earth and silence. Leora stood frozen, the words echoing in her mind. "You don't know what you'll become." What did it mean? What did they know about her, or humanity? Questions burned in her mind as the desert fell back into its eerie stillness. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The debriefing room was a cold, sterile box, its metal walls reflecting the dim yellow glow of recessed lighting. Captain Leora Grant sat stiff-backed in a chair bolted to the floor, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, a sharp undertone to the tension humming in the air. Across from her, Colonel Rain leaned back in his chair, his sharp, hawk-like eyes fixed on her with unrelenting scrutiny. "You're telling me," he said slowly, his voice rough with disbelief, "that the figure you encountered spoke to you. In English, yes, sir." Leora's voice was steady, though the memory still unsettled her. It said, "You don't know what you'll become." Rain exhaled through his nose, his fingers drumming against the surface of the table. Behind him, a large monitor displayed the recovered surveillance footage of the crash site. The craft was visible for only seconds before it vanished in a burst of energy that left a scorched crater behind. No figure, no further evidence of the encounter. "That's convenient," Rain muttered, glancing at the screen. "A ship that leaves no trace, and a visitor who disappears into thin air. You're sure this wasn't some kind of advanced drone or black project?" "Sir, I know what I saw." Her response was clipped, but the steel in her voice made Rain pause. He studied her for a long moment, then leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "And yet," he said, his voice softening to a dangerous edge, "you're the only one who saw it. The rest of your team only reported the light, the heat signature. No figure." Leora clenched her jaw. She'd already run through the events in her mind a dozen times, replaying every second like a loop she couldn't escape. But no matter how many times she thought it over, the truth remained unshaken. The figure had been there. Its voice had been real. "What about the sound?" she asked, her tone hardening. "The frequency we all heard before the craft disappeared. Have you analyzed that?" Rain's lips pressed into a thin line, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "We're looking into it," he said finally. Leora resisted the urge to press further. She could sense the weight of his doubt bearing down on her, but she wouldn't let it shake her conviction. The figure had spoken. The warning had been delivered. What it meant, she couldn't yet say, but she was certain it wasn't random. Hours later, Leora found herself back in the barracks, seated on the edge of her cot. The soft hum of the ventilation system filled the silence, a low and steady rhythm that did little to quiet her racing thoughts. The words haunted her. "You don't know what you'll become." The way the figure had spoken wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even ominous. If anything, it had sounded regretful, as though the being knew something she didn't, something she wasn't ready to learn. Her tablet vibrated on the cot beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a message from Sergeant Quinn. Urgent. Meet me in comm room 3. The communications room was a far cry from the sterile debriefing chamber. It was cluttered with equipment, monitors, consoles, cables snaking across the floor, and bathed in the dim glow of active screens. Quinn stood near the back, his arms crossed, his expression tight. "What is it?" Leora asked, closing the door behind her. He gestured to one of the monitors. "You need to see this." The screen displayed a waveform, its jagged peaks and valleys scrolling endlessly to the right. "This is the sound from the crash site," Quinn said. "The one we all heard." Leora frowned, stepping closer. "I thought Rain said they were still analyzing it." "They are," Quinn replied, his voice sharp with impatience. "But I ran my own analysis, and there's something you need to hear." He tapped a few keys, and the waveform shifted. The sound played through the speakers, low, resonant, and rhythmic, just as she remembered. "Okay," she said slowly. "What am I listening to?" Quinn adjusted a slider, isolating part of the audio. The sound changed, still low, but now layered, as though multiple tones were interwoven. "It's not just a sound," Quinn said. "It's a pattern, a signal." Leora's eyes widened. "A message?" "Maybe," Quinn said. "But that's not the weird part. Listen to this." He played the next section, and Leora's breath caught. Beneath the hum, faint and distorted, was a voice. It was barely audible but unmistakable, a single word repeated over and over, rising and falling like a whisper on the wind. Leora. Her name. "How?" She stopped, her voice faltering. "How is that possible?" Quinn shook his head. "I don't know. But if this is some kind of message, it's directed at you." Leora stared at the screen, her pulse pounding in her ears. The implications were staggering. How could a sound buried in the crash site's aftermath carry her name? Was it a coincidence or something far more deliberate? "What are you going to do?" Quinn asked, his voice low. She didn't answer immediately. Her thoughts were a storm, questions spiraling faster than she could process them. The figure's warning, the mysterious sound. And now, this. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. "I need more answers," she said finally. "Whatever this is, I'm not walking away from it." Quinn hesitated, then nodded. "Then I'm with you, whatever happens." Leora gave him a grateful look, though it was tinged with unease. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, or what dangers lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. The mystery wasn't just knocking on her door, it was breaking it down. The silence inside the research facility was oppressive, a heavy, almost tangible presence that pressed against Captain Leora Grant's skin as she walked the sterile hallways. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, their pale fluorescence washing out the colors of her surroundings. She felt the weight of her choices bearing down on her shoulders, the fragmented pieces of the mystery she'd uncovered refusing to align. Sergeant Quinn trailed a few steps behind her, his expression grim. His discovery of her name embedded in the alien signal had sparked a maelstrom of unanswered questions, and now, as they descended deeper into the heart of the base to meet with the scientists assigned to analyze the remnants of the crash, a sense of foreboding settled in Leora's chest. When they reached the secured lab, the door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a room cluttered with advanced equipment and holographic displays. Dr. Marin Falco, the lead researcher, stood near a console, her brow furrowed as she manipulated a series of floating controls. "Captain Grant," Marin greeted without looking up, her voice clipped. "And Sergeant Quinn, I assume you're here about the signal." "You assume correctly," Leora replied, stepping forward. "What have you found?" Marin hesitated, her fingers hovering above the console. Then, with a resigned sigh, she tapped a command, and a holographic projection flared to life. The image was a three-dimensional rendering of the alien craft, its surface alive with shifting patterns of light and symbols. As Leora watched, the symbols rearranged themselves, forming what looked like a sequence, a progression of sorts. "This isn't just a ship," Marin said, her tone weighted with significance. "It's a repository, a living archive." Leora frowned. "A repository of what?" Marin turned to face her, her eyes sharp. "Memories, data, entire histories encoded into its structure. We're still decrypting it, but from what we've uncovered so far, this craft contains information spanning millennia." The revelation struck Leora like a physical blow. Millennia? From where? From whom? Marin's gaze flicked to the hologram, her expression unreadable. "It's not just from one source. The data suggests contributions from dozens, maybe hundreds, of civilizations, some of them human." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a shroud. "That's impossible," Quinn said, breaking the silence. "Humans haven't had contact with other civilizations, not officially." Marin shook her head. "I don't know how or why, but it's there. And there's more." She tapped another command, and the hologram shifted to display a series of overlapping waveforms, audio signals interspersed with bursts of static. "This is the sound you recorded at the crash site," Marin said. "We've been analyzing it for patterns, and we found something unusual." The audio began to play, filling the room with its low, resonant hum. Beneath it, faint and distorted, were fragments of a voice. As the waveforms stabilized, the voice became clearer. "You don't know what you'll become. You don't know what you'll unleash." The words were identical to what Leora had heard at the crash site, but now there was something else, something layered beneath them. Another voice. "Stop them," it whispered, barely audible. "Before it's too late." Marin turned to Leora, her expression grave. "It's layered. Two messages, one embedded within the other. One warning us about what humanity will become, the other warning us to intervene before something happens. But there's no indication of what that something is." Leora's chest tightened. Every answer only deepened the mystery, and with it, a growing sense of urgency. As the hours stretched on, Leora pored over the decoded fragments of the archive. The data was fragmented, but recurring patterns began to emerge. References to a cataclysm, glimpses of a future where humanity's expansion into the galaxy had turned it into a juggernaut of destruction. There were glimpses of star systems reduced to ash, civilizations wiped from existence, all attributed to humanity's unrelenting ambition. But there was another thread woven through the archive, one that sent chills down her spine. Among the records were images of individuals, their faces rendered in haunting clarity. They were unmistakably human, yet subtly altered. Taller, their features sharper, their eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. One image stood out, a woman with pale, shimmering skin and piercing eyes. The figure from the crash site. Her file was tagged with a single name, Elira. "This can't be a coincidence," Quinn said, leaning over Leora's shoulder. "She's one of them." "One of what?" Leora asked, though she already suspected the answer. Quinn gestured to the holographic display. "One of us, or at least she was. This archive isn't just a warning. It's a record of what will become." Leora stared at Elira's image, her mind racing. If the figure from the crash site was human, or had once been human, then her warning wasn't just abstract, it was personal. The revelation came to a head when the facility's alarms blared to life. Red lights pulsed in the corridors, and a voice crackled over the intercom. "Security breach detected. All personnel to containment zones." Leora and Quinn exchanged a glance before bolting for the command center. When they arrived, the room was in chaos. Technicians shouted over one another as screens displayed fragmented feeds of the facility's perimeter. "What's happening?" Leora demanded, her voice cutting through the noise. One of the technicians turned, pale and shaken. Something's approaching the facility, multiple heat signatures, and they're not human. Before Leora could respond, the main feed stabilized, displaying the source of the disturbance. Figures moved through the desert, their forms shrouded in shadow. They were tall, humanoid, but their movements were too fluid, too precise, and their eyes glowed with an unsettling blue light. "They're here," Quinn murmured, his voice barely audible. Leora's blood ran cold. The craft had vanished, but its message had not. And now, the beings it had warned them about had arrived. The mysteries deepened, the stakes raised to an impossible height. Leora felt the weight of the revelation settle over her, heavier than ever. Whatever was coming, it wouldn't wait, and neither could she. The perimeter alarms continued their relentless wail, echoing through the labyrinthine corridors of the research facility. Captain Leora Grant stood in the command center, her pulse pounding in sync with the flashing red lights. On the monitors, the figures moved closer, silent, deliberate, their glowing blue eyes cutting through the darkness like knives. "These things," Quinn said, staring at the screens. "They're not human. Not anymore." Dr. Marin Falco's voice was tight, her fingers flying over a console. "They match the descriptions in the archive. Enhanced humans, a future iteration of us, or at least, a faction of us." Leora clenched her fists, her mind spinning with the weight of everything they had uncovered. The alien craft wasn't just a warning, it was a desperate plea from a future where humanity had become something monstrous. And now, a fragment of that future stood on their doorstep, ready to force their hand. "Options," she demanded, her voice sharp. Rain, who had arrived moments earlier and stood stiffly in the corner, finally spoke. "We're not waiting to find out if they're friendly. We defend this facility." "Defend it how?" Marin snapped. "Against beings designed to be superior in every way? You've seen the archive. They won't just outmatch us. They'll overwhelm us." Leora turned to her. "What about the craft? Could we use it against them?" Marin hesitated, her gaze darting to the holographic display. "The craft systems are partially functional, but we've only scratched the surface of its capabilities. If we activate it without understanding it, we could trigger something worse than what's outside." "Worse than them?" Quinn asked bitterly, gesturing to the screen. Before Marin could respond, the lights flickered, and the facility's power dipped. The monitors went dark for a moment, then blinked back to life, their feeds scrambled. "They're trying to breach the system," a technician shouted. "We're locking down, but they're fast." "Not just fast," Marin murmured, her face pale. "They're intelligent. They know exactly where to hit us." Leora stared at the chaos unfolding around her, a decision forming in her mind. "If they get in, we're done. We need to make a stand now." Rain stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "And what do you propose, Captain? You think you can stop them with sheer willpower?" "No," she said, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "I think I can stop them by giving them what they want." The room fell silent. "What are you saying?" Quinn asked, his voice low. "They came for the craft," Leora said. "It's the link between us and them, the thread connecting our past and their future. If they see us as a threat, maybe we can convince them otherwise. Show them we're willing to listen, to change." "You're suggesting we negotiate?" Rain barked a laugh, his voice laced with disbelief. "With those things?" "I'm suggesting we avoid a massacre," Leora shot back. "If we fight, we lose, but if we engage them on their terms, we might stand a chance." Minutes later, Leora stood in the facility's atrium, her breath fogging in the cold air. The reinforced glass walls provided a clear view of the desert beyond, where the figures had halted their advance. The tallest among them stepped forward, its silhouette framed by the moonlight. It was humanoid, but its proportions were unnervingly perfect: broad shoulders, lean limbs, and a face that seemed to blur the line between organic and artificial. Leora keyed her comm. "Open the outer doors." Are you insane? Rain's voice crackled in her earpiece. Trust me, she replied, though the weight in her chest told her she was gambling with everything. The doors hissed open, and a rush of cold desert air swept inside. The figure entered, its movements unnervingly smooth. It stopped a few meters from Leora, its glowing eyes fixed on her. I'm Captain Leora Grant, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. You've come a long way to find us. Why? For a moment, the figure said nothing. Then, its voice echoed in the atrium, layered and resonant like multiple voices speaking as one. You must not continue, it said. Continue what? Leora asked. The figure tilted its head, as if considering her. The path. Your kind's path. It leads to annihilation, for others and for yourselves. Leora swallowed hard. We've seen the archive. We know what's at stake, but we need to understand why. Why does humanity become what you are? The figure stepped closer, its gaze piercing. Because you were given the tools but not the wisdom to wield them, your ambition outstripped your morality. You expanded, consumed, and destroyed until there was nothing left to oppose you. And in the end, you turned on each other. Its words hung heavy in the air, each one cutting deeper than the last. So why warn us? Leora asked. Why not let history play out? The figure's expression shifted, just barely, but enough for Leora to catch a glimmer of something like sorrow. Because some of us remember what it was to be human. Back in the command center, Leora relayed the conversation to the team. Rain paced furiously, while Marin sat at her console, her hands trembling. They want us to change the future, Leora said. But they haven't told us how. Marin turned to her, her voice tight with fear. Maybe they can't. Maybe the only way to stop it is to end humanity's expansion now. That's not an option, Rain growled. No, Leora agreed, her gaze hard. It's not. But we need to find a way to change the trajectory without losing who we are. The next hours were a blur of tension and debate, with Leora caught in the center of it all. The more she listened to the archive's fragmented truths and the figure's cryptic warnings, the more she realized the choice she faced wasn't between victory and defeat. It was between survival and identity. In the end, she made her decision. She would return to the craft, and she would use its power, whatever it was, to send a message of her own. One not of conquest, but of hope. Because if humanity's future could not be rewritten, then it would at least remember who it was. The heart of the craft pulsed with a faint rhythmic glow as Captain Leora Grant stepped into its central chamber. The walls shimmered like liquid silver, their surfaces alive with shifting patterns that seemed to ripple in response to her presence. Behind her, the facility's comm system crackled with voices, urgent, fearful, desperate, but she blocked them out. This was her choice, her burden. At the chamber's core stood a pedestal, its surface engraved with intricate lines that spiraled inward to a single, glowing point. The artifact, alien and ancient yet somehow familiar, seemed to hum in resonance with her heartbeat. Quinn's voice broke through the static on her comm. Leora, you don't have to do this. There's another way. There has to be. She didn't respond. She knew Quinn meant well, but he couldn't understand. None of them could. The beings outside the facility, the twisted echoes of humanity's future, had forced her hand. They'd come not just to warn, but to ensure that the timeline was altered, and the craft, this enigmatic vessel of memory and possibility, was the key. Her key. The air in the chamber felt heavier as Leora approached the pedestal. Each step seemed to amplify the hum, the sound rising in pitch until it wasn't just audible, but tangible, a vibration that thrummed through her bones. Captain Grant, a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Marin standing in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. I can't let you do this alone, Marin said, stepping forward. Leora shook her head. This isn't your fight, Marin. It's not just your fight either, Marin countered. Whatever you're about to do affects all of us, and if you think I'm going to let you shoulder that alone, you don't know me very well. Leora hesitated, then nodded. Together, they approached the pedestal. The artifact flared to life as they drew near, the spiraling lines on its surface converging into a single point of blinding light. Images began to flicker in the air around them, visions of humanity's past, present, and possible futures. Leora reached out, her hand trembling, and placed it on the pedestal. The light engulfed her, and for a moment, she felt as if she were falling, not through space, but through time itself. The visions came in waves, each one more vivid than the last. She saw the rise of humanity, its expansion into the stars, and the unrelenting ambition that drove it forward. She saw worlds colonized and civilizations erased, their histories consumed by the insatiable hunger for dominance. And then she saw the cost, planets reduced to ash, stars dimmed before their time, and finally, a galaxy left hollow and silent, its once vibrant tapestry unraveled by the very species that had sought to master it. Amid the chaos, one image stood out: Elira, the alien woman who had emerged from the wreckage. Only now Leora understood. Elira wasn't just a visitor from the future. She was a remnant of what humanity could become, a survivor of the cataclysm who had chosen to return, to warn, to change the course of history. The vision shifted, and Leora found herself standing in a vast, infinite expanse. Before her stood Elira, her pale skin shimmering with an otherworldly glow. "You understand now," Elira said, her voice echoing like a symphony. "I do," Leora replied. "But understanding isn't enough. How do I stop this?" Elira tilted her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "You already know the answer. The question is whether you have the strength to do it." Back in the chamber, the light from the artifact intensified, its glow illuminating every corner of the room. Leora's mind raced as she considered her options. The craft was a tool, a bridge between timelines. It could alter the trajectory of humanity's future, but only at a cost. Marin's voice broke through her thoughts. "Leora, whatever you're thinking, just say it. We'll find a way together." Leora turned to her, her eyes filled with resolve. The craft's archive, its memories, its warnings, they aren't just records. They're a beacon, a signal that's been guiding humanity, pushing us toward the very future we're trying to avoid. Marin's brow furrowed. "You're saying the craft is responsible?" "Not directly," Leora said, "but its existence has influenced us. The knowledge we've gained from it, the technology we've reverse-engineered, it's all part of the cycle. If we want to break it, we have to let it go." "Let it go?" Marin asked, her voice trembling. Leora nodded. "We have to destroy it." The decision wasn't easy. The craft represented untold knowledge, a bridge to the stars. But it was also a curse, a catalyst for the very future they sought to prevent. As Leora prepared to activate the craft's self-destruct sequence, the figures outside the facility began to retreat. It was as if they knew what she was about to do and had accepted the outcome. Marin watched in silence as Leora entered the final commands. "This will set us back decades," she said softly. "Better decades than centuries," Leora replied. The chamber trembled as the craft's systems began to overload. Energy surged through the walls, and the hum reached a deafening crescendo. "Go," Leora said, turning to Marin. "Get everyone out of here." "What about you?" Marin asked, her voice breaking. "I'll be right behind you," Leora lied. Marin hesitated, then nodded and ran. As the craft's core reached critical mass, Leora stood alone in the chamber, her thoughts racing. She thought of the archive's visions, of Elira's warning, and of the path humanity might now take. In its final moments, the craft spoke, not in words, but in emotions: regret, hope, resolve, and then, with a blinding flash, it was gone. A days later, Leora stood on a barren hill overlooking the facility's remains. The craft's destruction had left a crater, its edges still smoldering. The future was uncertain, its path obscured, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Elira's words echoed in her mind. The question is whether you have the strength to do it. She had. And now it was up to humanity to find its own strength, to forge a future not out of conquest, but out of compassion. As she turned to leave, the wind carried the faintest whisper, "Thank you." And Leora knew, deep down, that they had been heard. Kale Oren stirred to the sound of static whispering in his ears. The dim light of his cockpit flickered uncertainly, casting sharp shadows that danced across the angular walls of his small, cramped starship. The hum of his engines was unnervingly absent, replaced by an alien stillness that felt heavier with each passing moment. Pilot designation, Kale Oren, an automated voice announced, dispassionate yet distorted. Critical systems offline. Unknown spatial coordinates logged. Emergency protocols in effect. Kyle blinked, his vision swimming as his mind clawed through the fog of unconsciousness. He didn't remember blacking out. The last thing he recalled was a routine survey run near the Caldrus Expanse, a region of space infamous for its impenetrable nebulae and treacherous gravity wells. But this wasn't Caldrus. Through the narrow viewport ahead, Kale saw nothing but void. Not the familiar glitter of distant stars, not the faint wisps of nebular gas, just a yawning, unrelenting blackness. It was as if the universe itself had vanished, leaving him stranded in some forgotten pocket of existence. He reached for the controls, his gloved hand trembling as he flipped switches and twisted dials in a futile attempt to restart the systems. The console sputtered to life in brief, erratic bursts, spilling fragments of data across the cracked screen. Coordinates? Nonsense symbols. Proximity sensors? Dead. The static in his headset grew louder, morphing into a low, pulsing hum that set his teeth on edge. Kyle yanked the headset off, but the sound persisted, vibrating through the walls of the ship. A cold shiver crawled up his spine. "Come on, Kale," he muttered under his breath, forcing calm into his voice. "You've been through worse. Just a malfunction. Run diagnostics, stabilize the core, and—" The words died in his throat. The hum was joined by another sound, faint at first, like a distant melody carried on a ghostly wind. But it grew louder, more distinct, until Kale recognized it as a voice. It wasn't speaking. It was singing. Kale froze, his pulse quickening as the eerie tune seeped into his bones. It was hauntingly beautiful, impossibly alien, and utterly wrong. The kind of sound that didn't belong in the rational universe he'd known all his life. With a reluctant hand, he pressed a trembling button to amplify the ship's audio sensors. The voice surged into clarity, its haunting song woven with a language that defied comprehension. The words, or were they notes, seemed to shift and shimmer, each syllable laced with an undercurrent of dread. "Who's out there?" Kyle called, his voice hoarse. "Identify yourself." The song faltered, then stopped. A new sound replaced it, a soft, rhythmic tapping that echoed through the hull of his ship. Kyle's breath hitched. The tapping was deliberate, calculated, as if someone, or something, was testing the integrity of the ship's exterior. He unbuckled his harness and stood, his movements slow and deliberate. The ship's gravity plating still functioned, though it felt weaker than usual, lending an unsettling weightlessness to his every step. He reached for his sidearm, a compact plasma pistol holstered beneath his pilot's jacket, and gripped it tightly. "Show yourself," he demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Kale strained to hear any hint of movement, any clue as to what was out there, but the void offered nothing. Then, without warning, the cockpit lights blazed to life, flooding the small space with a harsh, white brilliance. Kyle shielded his eyes, squinting against the sudden glare. When he looked again, his blood ran cold. The viewport, once filled with unbroken darkness, now revealed something impossible. An object floated in the void, a massive obsidian structure that defied logic and scale. Its surface was smooth yet irregular, as if shaped by both deliberate design and chaotic natural forces. Strange, glowing glyphs etched into its surface pulsed with a pale greenish light, their patterns shifting in a way that made Cale's head throb if he looked too long. And in the center of the structure, embedded like a malevolent eye, was a circular aperture that seemed to peer directly into Cale's soul. The tapping resumed. Cale turned, his gaze snapping to the rear of the ship. His pistol came up instinctively as the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the airlock. "No one could have," he whispered, his mind racing. His ship was adrift in an uncharted void, its hull sealed tight. There was no way anything or anyone could have boarded. Yet the tapping continued, each knock a deliberate punctuation in the symphony of dread. Cale moved toward the airlock, his every step an act of willpower. The hum of the alien structure outside seemed to resonate in harmony with the sound, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm that pulled him forward. When he reached the airlock, the tapping stopped once more. Kyle hesitated, his finger hovering over the control panel. The airlock's interior cameras flickered to life, their feeds grainy and distorted. At first, they showed nothing but empty space. Then, movement. A shadow flickered across the screen, humanoid but wrong, its proportions distorted and its movements jerky, like a marionette manipulated by an unseen hand. It paused directly in front of the camera, its faceless head tilting as if studying him. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. Whatever it wasn't human. The lights in the airlock blinked out, plunging the chamber into darkness. And then, in the cockpit behind him, the song began anew. Kyle's knuckles were white against the grip of his plasma pistol, his breaths shallow and uneven. The haunting melody that echoed through his cockpit was no longer faint. It was a siren's wail, each note laced with unspoken menace. It filled every crevice of his small vessel, pressing against the walls, reverberating in his skull. But the sound wasn't what terrified him most. The airlock behind him hissed, the sound unmistakable. A low clunk followed, metal grinding against metal, as if something or someone was attempting to override the ship's safety seals. Cale turned sharply, the pistol raised and ready, though his hands trembled with adrenaline. "Unauthorized access detected," the ship's automated system reported in its usual monotone, almost mocking in its indifference. "Manual override engaged. Proximity analysis inconclusive. Warning. External origin unidentified." Unidentified. The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp, slicing through Cale's fraying composure. "Not possible," he whispered under his breath. He keyed into the airlock controls, flooding the screen with a grainy feed of the external cameras. At first, the image was static, a blur of shapes and interference. But then the interference shifted, and Kyle's heart seemed to stop. A figure stood outside the airlock. Humanoid, but impossibly tall and angular, its limbs too long, its form obscured by a faint shimmering distortion, like heat rising from scorched metal. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It simply stood there, its featureless face turned toward the camera, as if it were staring directly at him. "Identify yourself," Kyle shouted, his voice cracking against the oppressive silence. "This is a private vessel. State your purpose, or I'll—" The airlock groaned, the grinding sound growing louder. The figure tilted its head, an almost curious gesture before it raised one impossibly long arm. With deliberate precision, it placed its hand, if it could even be called a hand, against the ship's exterior. The lights in the cockpit flickered, the ship's system stuttering as though that single touch had sent a shockwave through its circuitry. Cale stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. "This can't be real," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the rising hum of the ship's failing systems. A low vibration rippled through the floor beneath his boots. It was subtle at first, like the faint tremor of an earthquake, but it grew steadily stronger, rattling the cockpit's loose panels and scattering tools from their mounts. The lights flickered again, then died completely, plunging the ship into darkness. Kyle's chest tightened, his breaths coming in shallow gasps as he fumbled for the emergency power switch. His fingers found the panel, flipping it open and slamming the override. A dim, red emergency light flared to life, bathing the cockpit in a hellish glow. But the airlock was still hissing. Kyle spun around, gripping the pistol with both hands. He had one chance. If the seals broke, he'd eject the airlock, take whatever that thing was with it, and damn the consequences. His finger hovered over the eject control, and then the singing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, more unsettling than the song itself. It pressed against his ears, a weighted absence that made every creak of the ship seem unnaturally loud. "Kyle." The voice was faint, almost imperceptible but unmistakably human. Cale froze, his finger still poised above the control. He turned his head slowly, his eyes darting to the screen. The figure was gone. "Cale," the voice repeated, stronger now, echoing from the direction of the airlock. It wasn't just any voice, it was familiar. "Annika," he whispered, his throat tight. It couldn't be. Annika, his former co-pilot, had died 2 years ago during a disastrous mission in the Rigel sector. Her ship had been caught in a solar flare, its hull breached before Cale could reach her. He had heard her final screams over the comms, had lived with the guilt every day since. "Cale, please." The voice was pleading now, tinged with desperation. "Help me." His grip on the pistol faltered. Every rational part of him screamed that it was a trick, some kind of psychological attack. But his heart clenched at the sound of her voice, raw and familiar, cutting through the layers of disbelief. "Annika?" he called out, stepping toward the airlock. His voice was softer now, hesitant. Is that really you?" The vibration beneath his feet subsided, replaced by a chilling stillness. The airlock's outer door groaned, and then, with a sound like tearing metal, it opened. The red light illuminated a figure stepping into the airlock chamber. It looked like Annika. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her face, her pilot's jacket hanging just as it had the last time he'd seen her. But there was something wrong, something he couldn't quite place. Her eyes. They weren't her eyes. They were black, fathomless voids, glinting faintly in the crimson light. Cale's blood ran cold. He raised the pistol, his grip tightening. "You're not her," he said, his voice trembling. "Stay back." "Cale, it's me," she said, her voice soft and disarming. She took a step closer, her movements unnervingly fluid. "I don't know how I'm here, but I need your help. Please don't do this." His mind raced, torn between instinct and emotion. This was impossible. He knew it was impossible. But the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, it stirred something deep inside, a flicker of hope he thought he'd buried long ago. "Stay back," he repeated, his voice breaking. She stopped, her expression shifting to one of sorrow. "You don't believe me," she said quietly, "after everything we've been through." A shadow flickered behind her, momentarily breaking her form into jagged, unnatural fragments. Cale's finger hovered over the trigger. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Why are you doing this?" Her smile was faint, almost pitying. "I came back for you," she said, and then, almost too soft to hear, "You'll understand soon." Before he could react, the lights failed again, plunging the ship into complete darkness. Kyle fired. The sound of the shot was deafening in the confined space, the plasma bolt cutting through the blackness like a flare. But when the lights flickered back on, the airlock was empty. The only sound was Cale's ragged breathing, and then, from somewhere deeper within the ship, the singing began anew. The singing faded into the distance, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. Cale stood frozen in the cockpit, his pistol still raised, his heart hammering against his ribcage. The air around him felt heavier, as if the void outside had seeped into the ship, suffocating the space he thought was his sanctuary. He lowered the pistol, his hand shaking. The shadows of doubt clawed at his thoughts. What had he just witnessed? Was it some kind of hallucination? A trick? His training told him to rationalize it, to find the logical thread, but the echoes of Annika's voice lingered in his ears. The ship's systems buzzed to life without warning, startling him. The cockpit's main console lit up with fragmented streams of data, most of it unintelligible. One fragment, however, stood out, a single line flashing in pale, ominous green text. "You are not alone." Cale's blood ran cold. He stepped closer to the console, his pulse pounding in his ears. His fingers hovered over the controls, unsure whether to engage or disconnect. He tapped the screen lightly, trying to bypass the interference, but the words only repeated themselves, growing larger and brighter with each cycle. "Not funny," he muttered to himself, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his attempt at bravado. The console abruptly flickered, displaying a new image, a detailed scan of the ship. At first glance, it appeared normal. Outlines of the hull, systems diagnostics, and energy levels. But then he noticed something impossible. A second life form was aboard. Koyol stared at the readout, his throat tightening. It was in the rear cargo bay, an area he'd sealed off days ago after transferring his last shipment of supplies. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay in the cockpit, to find some way to jettison whatever it was before it could find him. But his curiosity, and the gnawing guilt over Annika, compelled him forward. Gripping his pistol, Kyle made his way through the dimly lit corridors of the ship. The emergency lights cast eerie shadows, making the walls seem alive, twisting and shifting with every step. The hum of the ship's life support system, usually a comfort, now felt oppressive, a constant reminder of how isolated he was. When he reached the cargo bay doors, he paused, his hand hovering over the control panel. The scanner had shown the life form inside, unmoving. But now, as he stood there, he swore he could hear faint whispers beyond the door. He keyed in the override code, and the doors hissed open. The cargo bay was dark, the emergency lights struggling to penetrate the gloom. The air was colder here, carrying a faint metallic tang that prickled at his senses. Kyle stepped inside, his pistol raised, every nerve in his body on edge. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. There was no response, only the faint rustle of something shifting in the shadows. Kyle moved cautiously, his boots crunching against loose debris on the floor. He swept his flashlight across the room, illuminating rows of crates and storage units. For a moment, everything seemed normal. And then he saw it. In the far corner of the bay, something crouched. Its form was obscured by darkness, but Cale could make out its jagged, unnatural silhouette. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. It just existed, a shape carved out of the void. "Stay where you are," Kyle commanded, his voice trembling. The figure twitched, a small, jerky movement that sent a chill down his spine. Slowly, it began to rise, unfolding itself like a grotesque marionette. As it stepped into the faint light, Cale's breath caught in his throat. It was the same figure he'd seen outside the airlock, but now it looked even more wrong. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, its head featureless save for the faint rippling distortion that suggested something hidden beneath the surface. And then it spoke. "Cale Oron." The voice was his own. Cale stumbled back, his pistol aimed squarely at the thing's center. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, mimicking his earlier movement. "I am reflection. I am truth," it said, the words vibrating through the air. "And you are the key." "The key to what?" Kyle snapped, his finger tightening on the trigger. "To the unraveling," it replied, stepping closer. Kyle fired. The plasma bolt shot through the figure, striking the wall behind it with a brilliant flash. The figure didn't flinch, didn't react. It simply stood there, as if mocking him. "You cannot kill what is already undone," it said, its voice growing deeper, more resonant. The cargo bay shifted around him, the walls bending and warping as though the ship itself were alive. Kyle stumbled, his head spinning as reality seemed to fracture. The figure remained unaffected, a fixed point in the chaos. "You are not who you believe," it continued, its voice now layered, as if multiple entities were speaking in unison. "Your path was chosen long before you knew it existed. The device you wield, the OmniShift, it is not yours. It never was." Kale's mind raced. The OmniShift was humanity's greatest achievement, a symbol of their dominance in the galaxy. But hearing those words, he couldn't shake the sense of déjà vu, the gnawing suspicion that the device wasn't what it seemed. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure raised one elongated arm, pointing directly at him. "To remember," it said simply. Before Kale could respond, the cargo bay was consumed by a blinding light. He shielded his eyes, the intensity searing through his senses. When the light faded, the figure was gone. Kyle was left alone in the cargo bay, the ship's systems humming softly as though nothing had happened. But the words echoed in his mind, refusing to fade. "To remember." He turned back toward the cockpit, his thoughts a maelstrom of confusion and fear. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. And deep down, Kale knew the answers he sought would come at a price he wasn't sure he was ready to pay. Kale slumped into the pilot's seat, his breath shallow and erratic. The events in the cargo bay replayed in his mind like a corrupted data stream, fragments of terror looping endlessly. The ship's hum felt oppressive now, its usual steady rhythm replaced by faint, discordant notes that only deepened his unease. He reached for the console, his hand trembling. The scanner still displayed the readout, one life form detected. Yet when he toggled the ship's internal monitors, there was nothing, no sign of the creature, no evidence of the anomaly. It was as if the entity had never existed. Kale leaned back, pressing his palms against his face, trying to steady himself. "Think," he muttered. "What do they want? What does it want?" The answer seemed to lurk just beyond his reach, taunting him. And then, as if triggered by his thoughts, the console flickered, the display shifting to a new screen. A map of the galaxy unfolded before him, dotted with countless star systems. One pulsed with a faint, insistent glow. The Rigel sector. Kyle's chest tightened. The Rigel sector was forbidden space, a graveyard of ships lost to unexplained anomalies. It was also where Annika had died, her screams cutting through static just before her signal vanished. The memory hit him like a blow, and with it came an unshakable certainty. The answers lay there. But traveling to Rigel wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. His ship wasn't equipped to handle the unpredictable gravitational distortions or the unexplained energy fields that had claimed so many others. Still, the pulsing signal on the map seemed to call to him, a silent beacon demanding his attention. Kyle stared at the coordinates, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could turn back, return to the safety of human-controlled space, and report what he'd seen. The Galactic Coalition would investigate, or bury the truth, as they often did. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. He input the coordinates, his fingers moving almost of their own accord. The ship's engines rumbled to life, the stars outside shifting as the autopilot plotted the course. "Destination confirmed. Rigel sector," the ship announced in its cold, detached tone. "Warning, extreme hazard zone. Proceed with caution." Kale smirked bitterly. Yeah, no kidding. And the journey to Rigel was uneventful, a deceptive calm that only heightened Kale's tension. The ship's systems performed routine checks, the hum of the engines steady and unwavering. Yet Kale couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, lurking just beyond the edges of perception. When Rigel finally came into view, the sight was breathtaking and terrifying. The star burned a brilliant blue, its light illuminating a vast field of wreckage, twisted metal, Shattered hulls and fragments of ancient ships drifted aimlessly, a testament to the countless lives lost here. Kale maneuvered the ship carefully, the debris field pressing in on all sides. The scanner beeped, alerting him to an anomaly ahead. A single ship hung in the void, untouched by the wreckage surrounding it. It was sleek and angular, its black surface absorbing the light from Rigel's star. Unlike the other derelicts, this ship appeared pristine, as though it had only just arrived. Kale's stomach churned. There was something wrong about it, something deeply unsettling. But as the scanner continued to ping, he realized the signal he'd been following originated from this ship. He approached cautiously, aligning his vessel with the stranger's airlock. The docking procedure was smooth, almost unnervingly so. "Kale, think this through," he muttered to himself as he grabbed his gear, a rebreather, a light pack of supplies, and his ever-present plasma pistol. The ship's systems warned him of irregular energy readings emanating from the derelict, but he silenced the alarms. This was what he'd come for. The airlock door slid open with a hiss, revealing a dark, empty corridor. The interior of the ship was unlike anything Kale had ever seen. Its walls pulsed faintly, as though alive, and an intricate network of glowing veins ran along the floors and ceilings, casting an eerie, shifting light. Kale moved forward, his pistol raised, every step echoing ominously. The ship's layout was disorienting, the corridors twisting and branching in ways that seemed to defy logic, and yet he felt an inexplicable pull, as though the ship itself was guiding him. He turned a corner and stopped abruptly. A figure stood in the center of the corridor. It was Annika. Kale's breath caught. She looked just as she had the last time he'd seen her, her pilot's jacket zipped halfway, her dark eyes wide with urgency. But her expression was unreadable, her gaze fixed on something distant. "Annika," he whispered, his voice trembling. She turned slowly, her movements deliberate and unnaturally smooth. When her eyes met his, they were no longer the void-like pits he'd seen before. They were her eyes, soft, human, and filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kale took a cautious step forward. "What's going on? What is this place? How are you—" "You're not ready for the truth," she interrupted, her tone firm. "But you've left me no choice." Before Kale could respond, the walls around him began to shift, the glowing veins intensifying. The air grew heavier, charged with an unseen energy that made his skin crawl. Annika raised her hand, and the corridor around them dissolved, replaced by a vast, featureless void. Stars blinked in and out of existence, their light swallowed by the encroaching darkness. Kale staggered, disoriented. "What? What is this?" "It's the beginning," Annika said, her voice echoing strangely. "And the end." As she spoke, the darkness coalesced into a towering structure, a monolithic obelisk that radiated an unnatural energy. Symbols Kale didn't recognize glowed faintly along its surface, their patterns shifting and changing as he watched. "This is what they wanted you to find," Annika said, stepping closer to him. "What you were meant to find." Kyle shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't understand. Why me? Why now?" "Because you're the only one who can choose," she said, her expression unreadable. "Choose what?" he demanded, his voice rising. Annika hesitated, her gaze softening. "To save them," she said quietly. "Or to end them." Kyle stared at her, the weight of her words crashing down on him. The obelisk pulsed with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, its energy seeping into him, filling him with a terrible understanding. He would have to decide the fate of humanity. Kale stood at the base of the obelisk, its towering form emanating a low, resonant hum that vibrated through his very bones. The symbols carved into its surface pulsed with an otherworldly light, shifting between patterns so complex they seemed alive, as though the structure itself was aware of his presence. Behind him, the void stretched endlessly, the remnants of the alien ship fading into the darkness like ghosts. Ahead, The obelisk loomed, radiating both power and finality. Cale's pulse quickened as Annika stepped beside him, her expression unreadable. "This is where it ends," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of sorrow. Cale turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Ends? What does that mean? What is this thing? You keep talking in riddles, Annika." She held his gaze for a long moment, then gestured toward the obelisk. "This is humanity's legacy, Cale, and its reckoning." He clenched his fists. "You're going to have to be more specific than that." Annika exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. The Omni-Shift wasn't just a technological breakthrough. It wasn't even human. It was a key, one that unlocked this. She motioned to the obelisk, her voice trembling. "This construct predates every civilization in the galaxy. It's not a weapon, not exactly. It's a decision engine." Cale's mind reeled. "A decision engine? For what?" "For the survival of intelligent life," she replied. "When civilizations reach a certain point, when their power grows unchecked, and their existence threatens the balance of the galaxy, this construct intervenes. It judges, and you, Kyle, have been chosen as its arbiter." He took a step back, shaking his head. "This is insane. I didn't ask for this. I'm just a pilot, a courier." "No," Annika said firmly. "You're more than that. You've always been more. The Omni-Shift recognized something in you, a capacity to choose when others couldn't. That's why it brought you here." Kyle looked back at the obelisk, his chest tightening. "And what happens if I choose wrong?" Annika's silence was answer enough. The obelisk began to shift as Cale approached, the symbols rearranging into new patterns, each one more intricate than the last. A low vibration rippled through the void, and a voice, not Annika's, not his own, echoed in his mind. "State your directive." Cale flinched, the alien voice resonating through his thoughts like a tidal wave. "What does that mean?" he muttered, glancing back at Annika. "It's asking you to decide," she said, her voice heavy. "Humanity's existence has destabilized the galaxy. The Omni-Shift has given your people the ability to cross vast distances instantly, but that power has consequences. Alien civilizations are rallying against you, and war is inevitable. The construct was activated to prevent that conflict, but the cost—" Her words trailed off, but Kyle understood. "The cost is us." Annika nodded. "The construct can wipe humanity from existence, erasing every trace of our species. Or you can choose to preserve humanity and risk the destruction of countless other civilizations in the war to come." Kyle felt his throat tighten. The weight of the decision crushed him, his mind racing with the enormity of what was being asked. "Why me?" he whispered. "Why not someone smarter, someone who—" "Because you understand loss," Annika interrupted, her gaze piercing. "You've lived in the gray areas, Cale. You've made hard choices before and you've survived them. That's what makes you the right person for this." He turned back to the obelisk, the voice echoing again. "State your directive." Kyle closed his eyes, the memories flooding back. Annika's laughter over comms, the first time they'd flown together. The faces of strangers he'd helped on countless missions, fleeting moments of connection in a galaxy that often felt so cold. And then, the darker memories, the greed of the coalition, the exploitation, the endless drive for more power at the expense of others. He opened his eyes, his resolve hardening. "I can't let humanity destroy everything," he said, his voice steady, "but I won't let us be erased either." The obelisk's light dimmed, its hum softening as though listening intently. Kyle glanced at Annika. "There has to be another way, a compromise." She tilted her head, her expression softening. "The construct is binary. It wasn't designed for compromise. But maybe—" Kyle stepped forward, placing his hand on the obelisk's surface. A surge of energy coursed through him, and the void around him dissolved into a cascade of images, galaxies colliding, civilizations rising and falling, a kaleidoscope of existence both vast and fleeting. And then he saw humanity, their triumphs, their failures, their capacity for both destruction and creation. He saw children laughing on distant worlds, soldiers weeping in the aftermath of battle, scientists gazing in wonder at the stars. "You can't erase us," he said aloud, his voice echoing through the void. "And you can't let us destroy everything either. We're flawed, yes, but we're capable of change. Give us a chance to prove it." The obelisk pulsed, its light intensifying. The alien voice resonated one final time. Directive accepted, conditions imposed. Kale staggered back as the construct's energy surged outward, enveloping him in a brilliant light. When he opened his eyes, he was back on his ship. The obelisk was gone, and the Rigel sector was quiet, the void around him calm and still. The ship's console beeped, and Kale's heart leapt as he saw the coordinates for home displayed on the screen. Annika's voice crackled over the comms, soft and faint. "You did it, Kyle. You found another way." He smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I hope it's enough." As the ship's engines roared to life, Kale stared out at the stars, their light brighter than he remembered. Humanity had been given another chance, and he intended to make it count. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.